Well, hello there and welcome back. So in the last video, we left off at this overview of the menstrual cycle. And we saw how it could be divided into several stages, right? The menstrual flow stage, follicle stage, ovulation, and then the corpus luteum stage. So in this video, we're going to take a closer look into each stage and to see what happens during each stage. Now to do that, we're going to go back and forth between three different diagrams, right? Sometimes we'll look at this diagram here, which shows you the overview, and then sometimes we'll look at this diagram here, which is showing you what happens inside the ovaries, and then sometimes we'll look at this diagram here, which is going to show you what happens inside the uterus, or what happens to the uterine lining. And this diagram here is also going to show you the hormones, the main hormones which are involved during the menstrual cycle. Now, most important of all for our syllabus is being very familiar with the hormones and also the changes in the uterine lining. Okay, so important, the menstrual cycle is controlled by these hormones. The changes that take place in the uterus, the changes that take place in the ovary are all due to the increase and decrease in levels of hormones. Okay, so let's get going. Alright, we begin with the menstrual flow stage. Like we already mentioned, this stage is when menstruation takes place, which is the shedding or the breaking down of the uterine lining. So if we take a look at this diagram here, the menstrual flow stage would be from day 1 to 5, and take a look at what happens to the uterine lining. Right, here is this bottom part of the diagram shows the thickness of the uterine lining. Right, we see that the uterine lining or the endometrium starts to break down and is discharged through the vagina. So that's menstruation. Right, next, let's turn our attention to the ovaries. So during the menstrual flow stage, the pituitary gland, which is found in the brain, right, hopefully you remember that, the pituitary gland will secrete a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, into the bloodstream. FSH will be carried through the blood to the ovaries, and it acts on the ovaries, the target organ. Now what FSH does, it actually can be found in the name. Follicle stimulating hormone actually stimulates the follicles inside the ovary to start developing. So that leads us to the next stage, which is the follicle stage. Right, so FSH is secreted, and then we enter into the follicle stage, which is from day 6 to 13. Alright, so during the follicle stage, what happens in the ovaries? Let's take a look at the ovary here. Okay, so it's important first to know a bit about the background. And the background is that ovaries contain many follicles from birth. Alright, so many of these follicles in the ovaries, and young follicles are called primary follicles. So in our diagram here, this is a primary follicle. It's basically a potential egg cell that is surrounded by layers of follicle cells. So follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, stimulates the development of these follicles. So during the follicle stage, a number of primary follicles start to develop. And as these follicles develop, they start to secrete estrogen. Right? So the ovaries start to secrete estrogen during the follicle stage. And eventually, usually, only one follicle, right, even though many follicles start to develop and secrete estrogen, only one follicle will fully develop into what is known as a Graafian follicle. So every menstrual cycle, even though many follicles start developing and secreting estrogen, only one ends up becoming a Graafian follicle, which is basically the haploid egg cell and a sort of a fluid-filled space. So eventually this Graafian follicle is the one that is going to give rise to the egg that is released during ovulation. Okay, so what happens during the follicle stage in the uterus? Right, so as you can see here, during the follicle stage, the level of estrogen in the blood rises. Now, why does estrogen rise? because estrogen is being produced by the follicles in the ovary, as we saw in the last slide. Now, estrogen has an effect on the uterus. It causes the uterine lining to be repaired and to be thickened. And why is that? Because, of course, the female is getting ready or preparing for the possibility of pregnancy. So this graph here is very important. Just take note that this line here represents estrogen, and it's very obvious because estrogen levels tend to rise during the follicle stage. Estrogen levels will rise after menstruation. Okay, just a bit of extra information for those who are interested. During the follicle stage, right, FSH is secreted by the pituitary gland, and that causes follicles in the ovary to start developing. Now, as those follicles develop, remember that they secrete estrogen, right? And we already saw how the estrogen causes the uterine lining to be repaired and to thicken. Now, estrogen has another important function, and that is to inhibit further secretion of FSH. So, estrogen also inhibits FSH from being secreted more. This is actually a form of negative feedback. Now, why is that? Because we don't want more follicles to start developing, right? So we've already had some follicles develop, there's estrogen coming out, and we don't want too many follicles to start developing. Now, one further effect of estrogen is that it stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete another hormone called luteinizing hormone, or LH. Now, LH, it turns out, is important for ovulation. So you can imagine the follicles are developing. As they develop, they secrete estrogen, and this estrogen causes the pituitary gland to secrete LH, and LH eventually will cause this Graafian follicle to rupture, and will cause ovulation to take place. Okay, and that's how we get to the next stage, which is ovulation. So after the follicle stage, we come to ovulation on day 14. So what happens in the ovary during ovulation? Well, an egg is released. Okay, so that luteinizing hormone, LH, remember estrogen levels were high. Okay, so as estrogen levels increase, it causes this luteinizing hormone levels to also increase, and that stimulates ovulation. Okay, luteinizing hormone is actually not inside our syllabus. So for your syllabus, all you need to know is that as estrogen levels rise during the follicle stage, eventually they also cause ovulation to take place. So estrogen levels together with luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation. So there you go, the egg is released. Okay, the follicle ruptures, it sort of breaks apart and releases the egg. And the ruptured follicle develops into a structure called the corpus luteum, which basically means yellow body because it looks yellow under the microscope. So this corpus luteum looks something like this. And you will notice that this corpus luteum produces progesterone, which is going to be important in just a while. Okay, so now if we look at our hormone and uterine lining diagram, you will notice, as I've mentioned, that during ovulation, the estrogen levels will peak slightly before ovulation. So estrogen will rise and rise and rise and rise. It will peak, and just right after that peak, ovulation will take place. Okay, so for a bit of extra information, here is the graph which shows you the level of luteinizing hormone as well over here. So you see estrogen levels rise and they peak slightly before ovulation, but luteinizing hormone peaks at ovulation, right? So estrogen levels will rise, causes luteinizing hormone to be produced by the pituitary gland. Then when LH peaks, that's when ovulation takes place. Now there's some interesting applications for this. For example, some women use certain chemical detectors to try to detect when they're ovulating, and those detectors kind of detect the LH levels, and that's helpful when you're trying to get pregnant. Alright, finally, after ovulation, we have the corpus luteum stage from day 15 to 28. Okay, so what happens in our ovaries during the corpus luteum stage? Well, the corpus luteum secretes progesterone and some estrogen as well. So the levels of progesterone and estrogen remain relatively high, and the corpus luteum will keep secreting these hormones until it eventually breaks down if there is no fertilization or pregnancy. Okay, so looking at this graph here, you can see that during the corpus luteum stage, the level of estrogen and progesterone remain relatively high. Okay, but progesterone is the main one that really rises up and its level is high. And the main function of progesterone, very, very important, is to maintain the thickness of the uterine lining. Right? It ensures that the uterine lining is well supplied with blood vessels. Okay, in the case that there will be an embryo implanting itself inside and developing into a fetus. Okay, so the important point is just to notice that this purple line here represents progesterone. And the extra point, for those who are interested, is that this progesterone, high levels of progesterone, also inhibit FSH and also inhibit ovulation. Now this is important because, now ovulation has already taken place, right? So we don't want more follicles developing and we don't want more ovulation because we already have one egg coming into the fallopian tube and the uterus. Okay, so we've looked at all the 4 stages, and now if fertilization does not take place, alright, so if there's no pregnancy, then what happens? Well, firstly, the unfertilized egg will break down, and then that will result in the corpus luteum breaking down. The corpus luteum in the ovary will eventually break down, so progesterone levels will decrease, right, because that was produced by the corpus luteum, and estrogen levels will also decrease. And when the levels of these 2 hormones decrease, then menstruation takes place and the cycle begins again. So you take a look at it here. If no fertilization takes place, then you will see that estrogen levels decrease, progesterone levels decrease, and then we start again with menstruation, right? Because without estrogen and progesterone, the uterine lining will break down. Okay, so you can pause the slide here. This is just a summary of what we've seen and what's important. So you need to know how the uterine lining changes. You need to know estrogen. You need to know progesterone, right? FSH and LH are extra. And you also need to roughly know how the follicle looks like as it develops across the menstrual cycle. Okay, we have one final point, and that has to do with a couple trying to have the best time to try for a baby. So what's the best time to try for a baby? Well, there's this period of time in the menstrual cycle called the fertile period. And that's the period of time where if you have sexual intercourse, there's a higher likelihood of conceiving a baby. So this is normally within plus minus 3 days of ovulation. So that will be between about day 11 to day 17, which is what you learned back in Sec 2. Okay, the rest of it is just called the infertile period. Okay, so the fertile period is from day 11 to 17, right? Well, if you read your textbook, it actually says that the fertile period is from day 11 to day 16, not 17. So why is it different? No, so is it 11 to 17 or 11 to 16? Well, I think that different textbooks and different sources have different answers. And that's because they make different assumptions. So let me explain that. Your textbook assumes that ovulation occurs on day 14 and that an egg can only survive for 1 or 2 days. So, if ovulation takes place on day 14 and the egg can only survive 2 days, 1 day, 2 days, then the latest time for fertilization will be day 16. So that's how they get day 16. Now, how do you get day 11? It's because your book assumes that the sperm can live up to around 3 to 4 days. So, what is the earliest time the sperm can enter? So if the egg is coming in on day 14, then the earliest time the sperm can come in is about 3 days earlier, which is about day 11, right? So that's how you get 11 to 16. However, if you assume that the egg can survive 1 more day, then you can actually get day 17 as well, right? So it all depends on your assumptions. Alright, before ending, I would like you to also read up your textbook on this page. We've already seen what happens to the menstrual cycle if fertilization does not occur. But what happens to the menstrual cycle if fertilization occurs? What happens to the hormones, estrogen and progesterone? Go find out